All right, my friends, let's talk about the secrets of editing books. And of course, I'm pulling your legs, or maybe just one, because these are no secrets. I would argue that any really good editor knows these things, whether or not they phrase them in the same fashion or not, but they probably apply them in their work. But I was on a call with an author today for about an hour. We had a very productive chat, and I thought to myself, wouldn't it be fun to share with translation, the rest of the translation world, the secrets, quote unquote, of book editing? So let's run through these. But first, as always, or almost as always, definitions, to honor the great Voltaire, Socrates, Descartes, and the rest. So there are different types of editing, and when people say edit, you should be very, very careful, as a translator especially, because people mean very different things by editing. Just to get this out of the way, but when in the translation world people say editing, sometimes they mean review. And by review, I mean checking meaning consistency between the original, the source text, and the target text. So sometimes people say editing and they mean that. Sometimes they mean proofreading, which by proofreading, I and most other people understand checking for typos, punctuation, and so on. But to me, neither of these things are editing. Editing is stylistic editing, at least how I understand it. But in the editing world, if we disengage for a moment from translation, and in this video we're actually talking about editing, there are usually, from what I understand, 4 categories of editing. Let me just run through these really quick so we pay our homage to definitions. One is developmental editing, where you're really working on the big picture, the panorama, like you're maybe rewriting a chapter. You're saying to the author, I think this is unnecessary, I think another chapter needs to be written, and blah, blah, blah. A less grand picture is line editing, where you're basically working on style. This is at the level of sentences and paragraphs. You're making the language more concise, or maybe more verbose. I'm just kidding, not more verbose, but if something needs an explanation, then you explain it. You know, you're thinking about word choice and such things. And also, of course, you're tackling grammar. Then you have what's called copy editing. And copy editing is between line editing and proofreading. Copy editing is usually fact-checking, consistency, grammatical consistency, but it could entail a little bit of proofreading. You know, if we were in Switzerland, I would say that Germany, which I believe is to the top, to the north of Switzerland. My geography is kind of hazy these days. So Switzerland would be copy editing, Germany would be line editing, and Italy, which I definitely know is to the south of Switzerland, would be proofreading. Anyway, hope you love my analogy. So those are the 4 types of editing. In my practice, I usually do not do too much of developmental editing, although it happens. Like just today, I thought of 2 extra sub-chapters and offered them to the author. So parts of editing could involve that, but I usually receive more or less finished and polished manuscripts, so I take it from line editing down. And translation will always involve editing anyways, right? Because it's a new quote-unquote book in a new language, so it needs an edit. And we could separate this edit loosely into 2 categories. One is the edit of your translation, and one is the edit of the author's book if it needs it. So as a side effect, quote-unquote, of my translation, we usually edit the book. It usually becomes more precise, sometimes more concise, more clear, and so on. And therefore, it's very useful to know what to do or not to do as an editor, because I believe it's part of the hat of any translator. Of course, if the book is picture perfect in every way, and I have not seen such a book, but it could be, then you don't need to do this. But then your translation needs an edit from an editor, whether or not you do this yourself or do it with the help of an outside editor, which I always recommend, and I use outside editors. It's still an edit. Okay, so that was the introduction. Now let's do the post-production. Haha. No, let's run through. I think we have 10 tips. All right, so first it's important to understand the product, the result of an edit. It's always very, very good to have the product in mind, right? So the product of a pen is to place ink on paper so that people can write. And also if it's beautiful and aesthetic, that helps. Okay, so I would say, don't quote me on this, this is just basically off the cuff. I don't know if it's this cuff or this cuff, but one of the cuffs. It's a book that reads well. I'm using my cheat sheet here. Comprehensibly, is fun, and communicates the author's original message. To some degree, it should be fun, you know, even if it's like whatever, a technical or medical text, as much as you can. It should be comprehensible and it should read well. And obviously it should also be, by well I mean like grammatically proper and all that jazz. So that's advice number one. Subproduct, it sometimes clarifies the author's ideas. In every single translation or editing job that I've done, obviously that happens. Not obviously, but obviously in editing, not obviously in translation. Okay, so that's tip number one, is know this product. Two, you're there for the author, right? Like, you're not there for your own ego. You're not there to change things. You're not there to show how amazing your vocabulary is. You're there for the author and for his book, and to communicate his message or her message, you know, whatever the case may be. And that ties in with a lot of the tips that go below, but that's super, super important to remember. Okay, now this next one might seem controversial, but I would say do not take the project unless you're very interested and excited. And you'll be like, but Vladimir, I need to feed my family, I need to eat, I need to survive. And I'm not saying this about every translation. You know, when I take on a document translation or a contract translation, I don't ask myself, am I super duper excited about this translation? No, not necessarily. But a book translation is a juggernaut. Even if it's a 20,000 word book, anything beyond that would probably be a short story or an essay. But that's a very small book. Still, that's a project, you know? So I think you'd be doing yourself and the author a disfavor if you took on a book that you were not excited about, or at least somewhat. I'll give you an example. The last book that I finished, I did not want it at first. It was huge. It was a little bit dry, and it was a business book, very brilliant, but a little bit dry. Then I got to reading it and I thought, well, what could possibly excite me about this book? Because I've translated a lot of business books. I didn't need the precedent. I didn't need the extra star on my translation wing. So I thought to myself, you know what? I'm just going to make the English as beautiful, as mellifluous, as polished as I possibly can. And that excited me, and I took on the book. And it wasn't without certain bumps on the road, but it turned out very well. The book is called Business IQ or Business Intellect. Anyway, next one. And I've talked about this before, but do challenge your authors. What do I mean by this? Don't challenge them to duels necessarily, nor to duets, but challenge them on anything that is incomprehensible, that should be changed, that the target audience will bristle at, or, you know, that the target audience will not understand. And I could probably give many, many examples. They're sort of vaguely in my mind, but I'll give you one example. I'm not gonna voice it out loud, but I'm editing this dating book and the author had a rather vulgar expression in there. You can guess what it might have been, but he's saying sometimes you have a group of girls that will protect their girlfriend so much that they will not allow the guy to, you know, do his thing, to make the approach. And he used a word that was very vulgar. And I said, well, can we maybe change it to they're being overly protective, or they're maybe protecting their beauty from the beast, quote unquote, you know? And he was like, yeah, that's fine. Now, if he had insisted on his phrasing, I would not continue challenging him, because after all, I pointed out what I wanted to point out, and voila. My job was to make him aware of this. But he listened to me, and he's actually a really cool author to work with. Now, there are some edits where I might have been more insistent. Like, if it is completely incomprehensible, if the word chosen is the completely wrong word, and it doesn't fit the definition, it doesn't fit the context, I would be very, very adamant. In fact, once, but I believe I've only done this only once, I said to the author, I wasn't really upset, but I was upset slightly at him not wanting to hear what I had to say, because my point was very, very logical, I believe. And I said at one point, you know, if we can leave it as you like, obviously you're the boss, but in that case I'm just going to disengage from the project, because I believe this makes zero sense to the readers. It is going to confuse the readers to no measure, to an infinite measure, you know. And at last he agreed. But that's the only, I'm not saying you should do this. Don't try it at home. Don't do this often. I've only done it once, I believe, in my career, because it was such a key term that, and I don't even remember what it was. But I'll give you an example of what it might have been. Not necessarily that it was that. It was something very key. But in this business intellect translation, the author had 3 stages of value. Something created, like a pen or a book or whatever, he calls value, which makes total sense. So stage number 1 is the creation of value. So far, so good. Stage number 2 is the optimization of value. And by this, he meant, how do you, by the way, that was not clear to me at first until he defined it, because to me, optimization might mean like, how do you make it perfect? How do you optimize it? But that's not what he meant. He meant, what is the optimum route to bring it to the consumer? So that we had to define as well, because it wasn't exactly clear. But point number 3 was a complete conundrum to me for about many months of the translation, until I finally had this aha moment. And that's when I really insisted that we explain this, because point number 3 was called conquest of value, right? You have creation of value, optimization of value, and conquest of value. The only problem was the value in point 3 was not the same value as in points 1 and 2. In 1 and 2 was the value being created by the entrepreneur. In point 3, the conquest was of money, because money is valuable to the entrepreneur, and now that he's created or she has created this value, they have the right to, conquer the market and take a share of the market. So by conquest of value, he meant value, financial value and market value on the market. But it's 2 different values, and at no point in the book did he say that these 2 things were different. So we really had battles about this, but finally I won. Because remember the previous point, I'm there for the author. So I don't challenge them unnecessarily. If it's like a little point, he wants to call this a quill, he wants to call this a writing device, whatever, I don't care. But if you're going to confuse the readers, you're gonna have to go through me first, only over my dead body.